Welcome to a podcast about the adventures of a divorced entrepreneurial father. Now, this is a hub of stories, cautionary tales, and life lessons behind the daily struggle to do better and be better and ultimately to find new sparks in life. And even if no one listens to any of these episodes, but I leave something behind for my children that sparks something in or even for them, well, that's good enough for me. However, if you do like what you hear on SparkHub, please support us by linking to the show notes below each episode. And once you're there, please consider subscribing to this podcast on the platform of your choice. And for the best experience, our newsletter gives you the inside scoop, exclusive content, and advanced previews of what's coming next. And by the way, your data is always private with us. We don't sell it, and you can unsubscribe from all of that at any time you want without judgment. So let's begin. My name is Alan, and I have a heck of a story for you. This episode is part one of two, and in both parts, I'm going to bring a deep focus to how I ended up becoming an entrepreneur and tell you some crazy stories along the way. Now, between the two parts, you'll take a wild ride through my past, which will cover stories from surviving a music competition at Disneyland in Florida through to what I learned in policing by scaring teenagers, the bears of Western Canada, and even how my brother's spirit guided me to new opportunities. And in all that, you'll meet characters like the Scottish Donald Trump and a crazy doctor from Saudi Arabia who issued death threats against me, and lots of stuff in between. So, as Steve Jobs once said in his famous 2005 speech at, I think it was the Stanford commencement address, you can only understand how past life experiences, i.e. the dots, have shaped your present by looking backwards. You must therefore trust that these dots will connect to form a meaningful future, even when the path isn't clear.
Being an entrepreneur is suffering pain, psychic pain. You get very little support. You're really on your own. The reality of it was, oh my goodness, what did I do? And the problem is, once you launch the ship, it either stays on the water or it goes down below. It's almost like an athlete. You have to suck it up and go through whatever that wall of pain is that you do in training. Reassess where you are. Make sure what you're doing as a vision is still in touch with reality. And if people just aren't responding, you try different ways, but you never give up. You never stop, because you will prevail if you have a worthy fantasy that is in touch with reality, where you're delivering something new and really great to people. And the fact that they're not accepting you is just temporary, and you have to outlast them, and you never stop.
So that was a clip by Steve Schwarzman, I think I'm getting that right, who's an American businessman and philanthropist. And I've put the video in the show notes below. I'm going to start with the heavy thought that every human alive has one currency in common: time. Rich or poor, a minute is a minute for everyone on planet Earth, just like a week is a week and a year is a year and so on. And there's no promise of tomorrow. Now, some of us may get a few seconds of life on Earth. Some of us get over 100 years, but nobody escapes alive. And that thought can be very overwhelming or motivating. Now, some people hope for an afterlife where perhaps better cards will be dealt to them. Others conclude there's nothing beyond our current experience and often wonder about leaving a legacy. One thing I've always had is an overeager sense of urgency and curiosity. I hate wasting time. And I've always believed in making every minute count, something that I clearly learned and shared with my father and my brother, both of whom have had a heavy influence on me and both of whom are featured in earlier SparkHub podcast episodes. In my own life experience, I've discovered that there's two types of people. There's people that are ambitious and people that are entitled. And the ambitious person doesn't expect anything, but strives to earn as much as they can through merit. By contrast, the entitled person believes, while they're on Earth and while they're spending time on Earth, that the world owes them something. and that they should get it without merit or blame others if they don't succeed. The truth is that nobody else wakes up dreaming about making you or me rich. So, personally, I've always felt very ambitious, and I've never expected anything unless I've earned it. Now, by contrast, again, there was a time that I used to wake up each day motivated by the dream of making myself, my wife, and my kids rich. But all that's changed. And before we get to that, let's first talk a little bit about the definition of rich or wealthy. Is rich having more money, more time, more health, more friends, more power, more toys, status, control? What does it mean to any of us during our time on Earth? Capitalism is a meritocracy, and it's designed to reward risk takers. That's how the system's designed. And I once heard the expression that a salary from a job is the price you pay to give up on your dreams. Now, there are, to my knowledge, 3 ways to accumulate a lot of money. And note, I'm not saying get rich. I'm just saying there's 3 ways to gain a lot of money. The first is to inherit a fortune from your family or marry into a wealthy family. The second is to win the lottery or a big payout on a game of chance or perhaps a lawsuit. And the last one is to create or co-create one or several profitable businesses that generate sustained profit or can be sold for a huge amount, hopefully with the founder as a major shareholder. Now, what the 3 things I've just listed off have in common is that most of that is down to chance and not effort. But the third one, with effort, can lead to chance. So which rich would you rather be? A person who has a lot of money, but I don't know, no friends, no family, locked in a mansion, possibly with health issues, or someone with a little bit of money, or building a fun business each day and doing something they love and surrounded by loving and supportive family and friends and people in good health? Of course, there's so many variations of that answer, but you take my point. To me personally, money was always about time and owning your own time to enjoy life, to create ventures that are social and allow me and those I love an ability to do things that we enjoy and, if possible, help others raise their game. And I don't have a specific dollar or pound value in mind as a target, but more if there's enough money to live a decent life and control my time, well, that's good enough, and everything else is a bonus. Now, as you're about to hear, either I was forced into becoming an entrepreneur who focuses his time on his own businesses, or in hindsight, it might have, I guess, always been my destiny, like Steve Jobs says, and it depends how you connect the dots looking backwards. Lastly, just remember, there's a difference between a solopreneur and an entrepreneur. The solopreneur is just a lone wolf who rarely succeeds. The entrepreneur brings people together to build commercial success on the shoulders of giants. So here's part 1 of the very strange road I took to becoming an entrepreneur and the lessons I learned along the way. My mom and dad could probably best be described as opportunity migrants. They left their own homelands at the time with no internet and no knowledge of what's over the horizon, and they left to build a new and better life in Canada. And that's when I came along. And if you've listened to any previous SparkHub episodes, you'll know that I spent a lot of my childhood outdoors and in nature in very extreme seasons. And I also lived and traveled to lots of different countries with my family and then eventually on my own. But let's fast forward to our first major lesson that I learned in high school when I was a teenager, and let's start there. Now, in high school, I played the trumpet in our school's orchestra as well as in the jazz band. Now, orchestra is very stoic because we're playing the classics. We're playing classical music, music that's been around forever. So that's always about timing, and it's about fine-tuning, and it's about playing the exact notes the sheet music expects of you with very little room for variance. It all has to tune, and if it's slightly out of tune, it's not authentic. Now, jazz band is the opposite. So there's always this underlying beat with jazz, which could change with the mood or whatever. But with jazz, you improvise a lot and you make the music up on the spot. And depending on your mood or the mood of the crowd or the audience, that's how that flows. And I've played the same instrument, the trumpet, but in totally different ways and environments. Now, one year, and I think it was probably 2 years before I graduated high school, our high school music group qualified to be the first Canadian group to compete in a band of high school bands in Florida in the US, and the battleground was an amphitheater in Orlando's Disney World. In order to get there, parents could either pay the full amount of money for their kids' trip, or we teenagers could go door to door selling oranges and grapefruits to raise money ourselves to pay for the trip, or a mix of both. So this became my first lesson in sales. I started pitching the wonders of grapefruits and oranges that my high school had on offer to neighbors and strangers, and explaining with sincerity that any sale meant my trumpet and I were one step closer to traveling to Disneyland if I sold enough. And that's quite a compelling proposition, and I really wanted to go. Now, I don't recall the details of how many citrus fruits I sold or if my parents ended up filling the gaps, but fast forward to a long bus journey from Montreal to Orlando, and then cut to me on stage at this massive amphitheater in Disneyland with my bandmates about to play orchestral and jazz music in front of a very loud American crowd who probably thought we all lived in igloos with our huskies and didn't have running water. The details are a bit fuzzy, but I remember being second trumpet, and the first trumpet, I think his name was Scott, he went ill or something happened, and suddenly I was asked to step up and play a trumpet solo at the last minute. Now, I had been rehearsing the solo as a backup, and there would be a moment in the piece of music where the band leader would wave his wand at me, the band would fall silent, and it would just be the sound of my trumpet until all the other instruments chime back in. I was extremely nervous, and the band started playing, and I remember vividly something that my jazz teacher told me. He said, "Remember, the audience is hearing the music for the first time in real time. They don't know what's coming. Only you do, because you're reading the music ahead and we've rehearsed it a million times. But if all else fails, just improvise and blow notes within the scale of the music. Just improvise." Well, it suddenly came to that, because as we approached the moment of the solo, I suddenly felt anxious and sick, and I couldn't read the notes on the page, and I just remember being just totally tuned out. And suddenly, I felt like I was out of sync with reality, is the best way I could describe it. And all I remember is missing the cue from the band's leader's wand. He pointed, and then a bunch of eyeballs swung up to look at me, and all I could hear was the other instruments fall away, and I'd missed my cue. And I suddenly just started playing some wild notes. I don't remember what I played. I just remember vividly seeing the shock on the band leader's face and the reaction of some of my bandmates, because they were used to hearing the original first trumpet play a smooth, rehearsed solo against my totally improvised solo. I just kept going, blowing random notes, and there was nothing like what we had rehearsed until the band chimed back in. And at that point, I sort of collapsed and sat down and just stopped playing, and I was deeply ashamed of missing my cue and screwing up the solo, and I just wanted it to end. I wanted to just die and run off stage, but then something happened. The crowd cheered really loudly, and then when the band leader, after the piece finished, he pointed his wand at me to single me out for the solo. Everyone had to get me to stand up, take a bow, and the crowd cheered even louder. And they loved my solo, and afterwards, my bandmates were kind of patting me on the back. So to this day, I recall we didn't come first. I don't think we ever won top position, but we certainly weren't last. And bearing in mind we were the first ever Canadian high school group to participate in an American competition, that was probably good enough. But the lesson I learned that day was that you should always practice something a million times, but then just be ready to improvise, because sometimes something better can happen. It's sort of opportunity favors the prepared mind, is an expression I really like. Now, let's jump ahead to another lesson, because a few years after that moment, I was wearing a law enforcement uniform, having graduated high school, for a private police force in the suburb where I lived, and I was studying at college in a 3-year degree to become a police officer. And it was there that I learned a massive lesson, not just about improvisation, which I'd learned in music in high school, but also about the power of discretion and reputation and karma. So one night, I was on a night shift, and I was patrolling a municipal park, and there were some teenagers hanging out there after hours. Now, normally, the procedure we were taught was to ticket anyone in the park after hours, as very often there was vandalism and drinking and drugs. And if we didn't do that, it would continue. But instead of jumping up on the teenagers and being aggressive, I listened to them, And I heard that they were local and they just wanted to go home and hadn't realized the time. So maybe they were lying, but I said, look, once I'd understood where one of them lived, and he showed me a piece of ID, which was actually just on the other side of the park, it occurred to me that to ask them to walk around the park would be longer and possibly more dangerous. So I said to them that normally they would get fines. However, I would take their IDs and names and let them off with a warning if they promised to walk through the park to where one of them lived. They all agreed, and I said I would go check the park chalet, then drive back through the park, and if they were still there after that, I would issue them all with fines. So they thanked me and they walked into the park, and I headed towards the chalet to check it. Now, what I didn't know was there was another patroller named Mario who was on the other side of the park. And Mario was a very overzealous law enforcement officer who was by the book, and he loved writing as many tickets and arresting as many people as he could during his shift, like it was some kind of competition. And he very often drove with his patrol vehicle lights off in phantom mode so he could sneak up on people and any suspects, he called them, and then suddenly light them up out of nowhere and create a heck of a scene that was more like out of a movie than how you probably want to do things. Now, I thought Mario was somewhere else at the time I'm telling you this story, and he was out of his sector. He was in my sector with his car in phantom mode as these teenagers walked through the woods. And then he sprung. Remember, I'm at the chalet thinking these guys are gone, and in the distance, I suddenly saw the woods flash and light up as Mario flung on his strobe lights and his floodlights, and I heard loud noises and whoop, whoop, sirens, and suddenly I heard Mario's voice yelling over the radio in a very breathless manner that he needed backup for suspected drugs in the park. And by the time I sprinted over to his location, he had called for police supervisors, and he'd had the teenagers up against a building, hands spread, legs spread, absolutely trembling in fear like this was some kind of gang takedown. Now, Mario always overreacted to everything, but when the teenagers saw me arrive, they screamed, "Help, help, tell him what you told us." And I said to Mario that they were walking through the park under my instruction. Now, Mario claimed he saw drugs being used, and he would search them all once the police supervisor arrived, and he would then book them all. Now, normally, kind of an unwritten rule, but you're never supposed to argue on a scene in front of people, in front of the public, with a senior officer. And I was really young. I was about 18, I think. But I kept repeating that it was my discretion and under my instruction that these teenagers were allowed to walk through the park for their own safety and also given where they lived. I knew nothing about drugs, but Mario insisted he had seen some rolled up tin foil as his evidence before coming out of phantom mode to surprise everyone and start to instruct a bus. So by the time the supervisor arrived, Mario and I were arguing with the teenager still against the wall, unsure what to do. In the end, the supervisor said it was my sector, my discretion, and we let the teenagers go without ticket or charge. Mario said he would never work a shift again with me, and over time, actually, he was forced out because of too many complaints and crying wolf too many times. People just didn't want to work with him. But here's the kicker. Cut forward about 5 years, and 4,691 kilometers west of that location, so going from Montreal to Whistler, British Columbia. And now I'm driving a ski bus in Whistler, BC at the Chateau Whistler Resort, which is a 5-star all-season resort. I was a bellman and a valet, and because I had passed emergency vehicle training for police college many years ago, I was one of the few members of staff who was qualified to drive the shuttle bus when hotel guests needed collecting from the ski slopes. So it was kind of a fun job, kind of a perk. On one occasion, I was called out to pick up a middle-aged man and some young adults, and they all got on the shuttle and sat at the back. And as I was driving, I was looking up in my rearview mirror, and I could see one of the young adults pointing at me and talking to the older gentleman. We got back to the hotel, and I opened the back door for them to get off. And I heard one of the young men say to the older man, "That's him, Dad. That's him, Dad." So the dad approached me, walked up to the front of the bus, and he had a very stern look on his face, and I thought I'd done something wrong. He started by asking me where I was from, again, very sternly, and it turned out he was from the same suburb in Montreal that I was. And then he asked if I had ever worked as a patrolman in that suburb years back, and I said yes, cautiously, thinking it was a bit weird that I was 5,000 kilometers removed. And he asked me if I recognized his son, one of the young men that was with him, and I said no, I didn't. He went on to say that his son recognized me, and he recalled that he and his friends had encountered me in the park and that I was kind and let them walk home before an overzealous officer scared them by flying out of the dark and accusing them of using drugs. He said his son never got my name or badge number, but he walked away with his friends because I stood up for him and took responsibility against my own partner. I acknowledged I sort of remembered something like that had happened, and then out of nowhere, the man produced a $50 bill, which was a massive tip back in those days for a shuttle bus driver. And he said that had I not been there, and had his son been arrested or ticketed by Mario or anyone else that night for walking in the park, he wouldn't have gotten into law school, and now they were in Whistler on a family trip, celebrating his acceptance into law school. So in short, his son's life could have taken a much different direction had I stayed silent. And don't get me wrong, it was super nice to make $50. But the real joy was knowing that a decision I took had changed the course of someone else's life for the better. And I remember it because it was a karma moment. And it taught me that integrity is everything and that your reputation is everything, and always trust your gut. So in any situation, you have discretion and you should use it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I want to come back to Whistler and the shuttle bus in a moment to talk about a lesson that I learned from the Bears. But let's just go quickly back to when I was still in college for 3 years studying to be a police officer while working as a private patrolman and a cadet for the Montreal Police. Beyond the story you just heard about shaking down scared teenagers, working in the police on different shifts with different teams was a whole lesson in psychology and dealing with people of all different shapes and sizes. And I learned so much about how to handle so many different situations. However, sliding doors moment here, when I was about to graduate from police college, the landscape in policing had changed. So where once there was a promise of good salary, benefits, and funding for higher education on offer in return for one's service, which is basically all the reasons I wanted to sign up for the profession, the government changed the hiring process where I lived to having pay for your training. Then all that was on offer afterwards was part-time or low pay, with no job security and hardly any benefits, and thousands of recruits coming out of the academy competing for scraps. So suddenly I decided at the age of, I must have been 20, 21, that going to university would probably be a better bet. And if I ever wanted to return to the policing profession later on, I could come back with a degree and start higher up. So I moved to Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, to pursue a business and commerce bachelor's degree. And while I was there, I completely changed profession by applying to work at the Chateau Laurier Hotel as a security person, but actually the Chateau Laurier Hotel is a prestigious hotel right next to Canada's Parliament buildings. I ended up getting a job as a night shift bellman and room service agent, which is completely opposite. So this change in profession, going from law enforcement to premium customer service in hotels, I always joke it was like going from kicking ass to kissing ass. It was a complete 180. I had to switch my mindset from being suspicious of everyone to doing whatever was asked of me, even if I didn't like it, but within limits. So on many occasions, given I was on night shift at a premium hotel full of high rollers, from politicians to businessmen to celebrities, I saw it all. Being asked to do more than just deliver luggage or park nice sports cars or shine bell carts or run midnight snacks to premium suites. I was asked to score drugs. I was asked to find prostitutes. I was asked to prevent hopped-up guests from driving away drunk or arriving drunk. I dealt with homeless invaders and much more with some very high-profile people who shall remain nameless. And I did all of this at night while earning a degree in commerce by day. But I knew where my real education came from, and one incident in particular still pays dividends in my business life today. I had a good friend called Jean-François Vary, who was also studying business at Ottawa U, and he earned his way to being a night manager at the Chateau Laurier. So he was management while I was just frontline staff. Now, Jean-François, or JF, was one of the most zen-like people I knew. And one evening, a very high-profile guest stormed down to the front desk in the wee hours of the morning, and he first accosted me at the concierge desk. I think I was shining a bell card or something. And right away started screaming at me that he couldn't sleep because of noise on his floor. Before I could even respond, he shrieked and banged his fists on the desk that he wanted a manager, he wanted a refund, he wanted an upgrade, and he was going to sue anyone who didn't give him what he wanted. That was his opening gambit. Now, I obviously was a bit angry and taken aback, And some of my old police instincts kicked in, and I remember feeling like I wanted to tackle him or pepper spray him or something. But I was in a different uniform in a whole different setting, and that's when JF came out to the front desk to the enraged guest and said calmly, "Hello, sir. I'm the night manager." The man unloaded on Jean-Francois, getting right up in his face, shaking his fists, and to my amazement, Jean-Francois just stood there, calm as you like, nodding until the guest ran out of things to say and shouted, "How are you going to make this right?" Now, I just need to add that Jean-Francois was very well built. He had massive shoulders, massive arms, but he wasn't tall. And the angry guest was very tall and very large in body. So he was looking down on Jean-Francois as he was raging. And Jean-Francois didn't respond right away. He left a little bit of silence. He let the silence fill the gaps. He waited a few beats. And just that alone seemed to bring down the temperature. And then when Jean-Francois spoke, he didn't raise his voice at all. He kept it low, as if he was forcing the angry man to listen closer. And I could see the large man was physically lowering himself down to Jean-Francois' height to hear what Jean-Francois had to say. And JF was bringing the angry guest to his level. JF offered that he had understood everything the man had to say, and he apologized and offered that he was going to take action. He asked that in order to help the guest with all of his requests for compensation, he began by asking the guest what suite number he was in. The man told him the room number, and Jean-Francois then did a judo move like I've never seen or hadn't seen before up until that point. First, he apologized calmly for any inconvenience to the man's sleep, citing it's beyond unacceptable for that to happen in a hotel like ours, and the man just kept nodding, waiting for compensation. Then calmly, JF explained that a room a few doors down from his had called an ambulance because the guest in that room had suffered a heart attack. What the angry man had heard were paramedics trying to save another guest's life. And a few minutes before the angry guest came down screaming at me and Jean-Francois, a worried family was in the lobby, surrounded by emergency people and ambulance techs, and they just pulled away from the hotel with sirens and lights blaring, which probably also disturbed the man's sleep. Jean-Francois then looked, with confidence, straight at the angry guest and reaffirmed he was sorry about the disruption to the man's experience in a hotel. However, JF then politely requested if he could step away for a bit as he had some emergency calls to make to the guests, the other guests and family, and then he would happily follow up with the angry guest to resolve any complaints he had in light of the circumstances. Again, a silence fell, and the color of anger just drained from the angry guest's face. Jean-Francois didn't ask. He just said, "All guests are our priority. However, I'll hope you allow me to focus on the emergency for now, and rest assured, sir, your comfort is my next priority." The once angry guest just basically sheepishly just walked away and flubbed and deflated. Everything was diffused, and my shift was long enough that I saw that guest come down the next morning, leaving nothing but praise for the experience he had had at the Chateau Laurier. Music taught me about improvisation. Certain experiences in law enforcement taught me about integrity and reputation. But Jean-Francois used improvisation and integrity, but he also leveraged empathy, de-escalation, and perspective. Now flash forward a few years, first passing through Banff, Alberta, then to Whistler, British Columbia, where after graduation from university I transferred hotels to work in the ski resorts, and Jean-Francois and I were reunited in the Rocky Mountains. This time he was a higher up manager. I was still front staff. I was a valet and a bellman and a shuttle bus driver. And I say this because 2 more lessons came my way while living and working in the Rocky Mountains. One from nature and one from Microsoft. In both the hotels where I worked, in Banff, Alberta, and then in Whistler, British Columbia, staff training involved learning not only how to give guests the 5-star experience, but also how to practice safe sex and not get into any deadly fights with local wildlife, which included elk, wolves, and bears, and more, all of whom roamed freely in the area. It was very normal to see wild animals in civilized areas, and respect for them was paramount. In particular, in Banff, and especially during what they call rutting season when the elk have their babies, simply walking between an elk and her calf as you came out the bank or a bar innocently, and if you ended up walking between the two, that could result in an attack that would leave you very seriously injured or dead. And we always knew instinctually that as we walked, you jingled or you whistled or you made noises on hikes or when you were walking home from work to staff accommodation, which was in the woods. You had to do that because if bears or other animals heard you coming, they'd get out of your way rather than confront you. And if a bear or an elk attacked, it was 99% of the time because it was surprised or it had calves or young cubs. So if they heard you coming, they would more likely than not move on. So the locals knew this, and we were trained to know this in staff training, but we also had to look out for tourists in particular, and not to single anyone else out, but Japanese tourists who used to come and run right up to the wild animals to try and get photos or put their kids on their backs to get photos. Trust me, it was a wild place to work. Now, in particular, garbage disposal was kind of key because any litter would attract roaming animals, hence all the garbage receptacles were bear-proof, meaning you had to unlock the garbage before you putting your garbage in so the animals wouldn't come foraging. So I say all this because I want to set the scene for what all of that taught me about boardroom strategy. Contrary to old folk tales, playing dead if you come face to face with a bear is not recommended. They'll just simply kill you more slowly while you're lying down, so I'm told. But neither is it a good idea to run away from a wild animal because bears are faster and better climbers and swimmers than you. So the joke always goes that you don't need to be a fast runner to escape a bear. You just need to be faster than the person you're hiking with. Anyway, the real insight I gained is that bears are short-sighted. So as I mentioned, they actually aren't aggressive unless they're surprised or have little cubs you might innocently walk in front of. And when I grew up camping as a child, wild camping, we would put our food up in the trees when we slept because if bears came through our campsite, as long as we stayed still and we didn't have any food in our tents, they would just walk on. They wouldn't trouble anyone. So now as an adult out west in the Rockies, I learned more about bears in staff training, and we learned about something called bluster. Bluster is when a bear rears up and gets as big as possible and as menacing as possible and tries to scare away a predator or another bear or anyone else. And it's sort of a combat avoidance technique because if you show fear when a bear is blustering, they will switch their intent. So what I was taught is if you can bluster more than a bear, you can scare it away. How do you do that? Remember, they're short-sighted. First, the lesson went that you need to appear bigger than a bear or make a loud noise, or ideally both. And if a bear perceives that you're bigger and more ferocious than it, and now remember, I'm using the word perceives here, it'll most likely back off. So, you may recall the story I just told you about Jean-Francois and the big angry guest. That was, in effect, bluster, but Jean-Francois dealt with the situation by being the bigger man over time and through empathetic conversation and changing the perspective. You can't do that with a bear. One day I was out biking with a bunch of friends and suddenly I crashed into a bear who I didn't see on the path because I was going at great speed and I think I was looking the wrong way or something, but I hit a bear. I crashed into a big bear and I fell off my bike, but still managed to hold on to the bike as I hit the ground. And when I looked up, I saw a very confused bear looking back at me, and I was scared for my life. And then suddenly the bear reared up and raised up and roared. And for some reason in all of that, I remembered the training. So I remembered not to play dead. I remembered not to run away. But by instinct, I stood up and I put my bike above my head and I shook it and I screamed back. And by doing that, I appeared bigger than the bear. So remember, this is perception. The bear was way bigger than me, but I looked bigger than him. And suddenly he changed his mind and he ran back into the woods and a fight was avoided. Total accident. It was a total accident. And it's possible maybe I could have outbiked the bear, but I remembered the training about how bears don't always want to fight, but they'll always bluster first. A bit like a puffer fish that expands to scare off other fish, but they're just full of air. So the lesson I learned that day, again by accident, has played out time and time again to anyone who tries to bully me or try to make a bad deal with me or intimidate me. I remember that 99% of the time when someone's doing that, they're blustering. And As I learned in music, you can rehearse a million times. If you know your numbers and you know what you're talking about, you can appear bigger than that person without having to resort to violence or argument. So, music taught me about improvisation when in front of a large audience. Policing taught me about the importance of integrity and reputation because it will outlive you. Jean-Francois taught me about empathy and perception change. Bears taught me about blustering. One final conversation on top of all of that at Whistler changed my life forever. At this stage in the story, I'm 24 years old, working at the Shadow Whistler Resort as a service position. And as I was watching Jean-Francois climb up the corporate ladder, having done the same degree as me, about the same age as me, I was really, really worried. I was very preoccupied that I'd worked hard over the past 6 years to get a college degree, then a bachelor's degree. In high school, I'd been in music, and I thought, I don't know, I just didn't know what my career path was yet, but it was the first time in my life since the age of 14 that I was only working. Before that, I was working and going to school at the same time. And as I got older, I used to work at night and go to school in the day, so my sleep patterns were very screwed up. Then one day, a man walked out onto the front courtyard of the Shadow Whistler, where I greeted him. I asked him if he needed me to fetch his car or arrange transport or whatever, and he politely said no, and he kind of waved a cigarette at me, sort of saying, hey, I'm just here for a smoke and some fresh air. But we struck up a conversation, and I confessed everything I just said to him. He asked me what my story was, and I said, I'm 24 years old. I'm worried about where to go next in life. I've got friends who are on a career path, and I don't know what my path is. And I was kind of in policing, but maybe not doing it anymore because the government changed everything. And he just started to chuckle, and he asked if I recognized him. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't. He asked if I noticed who was occupying the hotel at the moment, and I said, yeah, of course, Microsoft is here, up from Seattle. They were doing a massive conference or a product launch, I can't remember what. They usually did lots of that stuff in Whistler. He asked me if I knew who Bill Gates was, and he asked me if I knew who Steve Ballmer was, and I said, yeah, of course, I know who these are. I studied them in university, in business school. I studied the business. Of course I know them. Now this man, and actually he never told me his name, he said, look, kid, I'm very senior in Microsoft, and I work directly with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. But I'm behind the scenes, and no one ever knows my face or my name except the people in Microsoft, and I'm here leading the conference. And he said when he was younger, even younger than me, he kept going to school, earning up to a master's degree before joining Microsoft at about my age, mid-20s, and climbing the corporate ladder for 2 decades until he got to his current position. And it was very clear by his car and his watch and everything that he was rich. He was rich, and he said he was nearly 50 years old, but he was tired, and he was unhealthy, and he even waved the cigarette to make the point. He was several times divorced and with many children that never called him except if they wanted money, and he had lots of ulcers, and his only solace was taking a smoke break in Whistler once in a while. And he looked at me and he said, if I could go back in time and talk to 24-year-old me with all the options you now have ahead of you and all the education, I'd tell myself to take a year off, work in a ski resort, make some cash, party, enjoy nature, and then travel the world before starting any career or getting married. And he said, it's too late for me now, but make no mistake, kid, I would change circumstances with you in a heartbeat. Take your time. And he extinguished his cigarette and he walked back into the hotel. Music, policing, bears, angry hotel guests, and now this guy from Microsoft was just all snowballing. And over 2 decades later, I would give the exact same speech that you just heard to someone in Nevada, of all places. But that's all coming in part 2, because everything you just heard made me decide to move to Australia, where a whole bunch of other things happened. And then I would eventually come back to Montreal and end up in the UK via Israel, with the common element of the journey continuing and the learning continuing to becoming an entrepreneur. And you wouldn't believe the amount of bluster I would face as I headed on that direction. So I look forward to telling you more about that in part 2 of my tales of how I became an entrepreneur. Thank you for listening. To support SparkHub, please have a look at the show notes below this episode. or visit thesparkhub.com to sign up for our newsletter, which offers exclusive inside scoops. Just quickly, the music you're hearing is composed by Shi Haoyan Shi, and the audio engineering is done by Emily Chung. My name is Alan, and I hope that you dream big and something sparked in you today.